Title: The Ghost Eater's Burden. Chapter 1: The Hunger Awakens. The air was thick in the house that Seth had inherited from a distant relative, an uncle whose name he had never cared to remember. The walls creaked like ancient bones, groaning under the weight of centuries of neglect. Dust clung to everything, like a shroud, as though the house itself had not seen the light of day for decades, if not longer. The roof was sagging, the windows cracked, and the floors were warped with time. But what struck Seth most was the silence, the oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to crawl under his skin and nestle deep in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had moved in a week ago, after the death of his mother, and since then he hadn't spoken a word. The funeral had passed in a blur. The days that followed a disjointed collection of memories that slipped through his fingers like smoke. He was not grieving, at least not in any way that made sense. What he felt was a strange, hollow emptiness, a gnawing void in his stomach that nothing could fill. The house was his inheritance, but it felt more like a prison. There were no neighbors. There was no town. Just the wind, the rain, and the whispers of forgotten things that lurked in the shadows. Seth had always been drawn to the darkness. Even as a child, he had sought out the corners of rooms, the places where light failed to reach, and listened to the silence that thrummed beneath. But here, in this decrepit house, the silence was not empty. It was alive, and it had a taste. It began one night when Seth, restless and unable to sleep, wandered through the creaking halls. He was drawn to a room at the back of the house, one he had not dared to enter before. The door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting him in, and as his fingers touched the knob, a strange sensation bloomed in his chest, a tingling, an electric hum that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house. The air inside was thick with something that Seth could not describe, but it was as if it were pressing against him, pushing him into the room, compelling him to stay. He could hear the faintest of whispers, like a distant conversation that he could not quite catch. He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud. Seth turned around in surprise, his heart racing. But when he reached for the door, he found it locked. Panic began to gnaw at him, but something deeper, something instinctual, held him in place. The room, if it could even be called that, was not quite what he had expected. There was a faint light, like the moonlight filtered through thick, misty fog, but it did not seem to come from anywhere. The walls, lined with faded wallpaper, were covered in strange symbols, some drawn in red, others scratched deeply into the wood. It felt as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. In the center of the room stood a large, worn-out chair, the fabric shredded, its wooden legs bowed with age. It was placed directly under an odd-shaped window, one that had been blocked off with what looked like thick black curtains. And at the very edge of the chair, barely visible in the dim light, something shifted. Seth froze. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then it moved again. The thing on the chair was no longer still. It was breathing, a soft, shallow breath, almost imperceptible. His heart pounded in his chest, the silence pressing in on him, suffocating him. His instincts screamed for him to leave, to turn around and run, but his body refused to obey. The whispering had grown louder now, a soft murmur that swirled around his ears, wrapping him in its sinister embrace. He reached out toward the thing, his hand trembling, and as his fingers brushed the back of the chair, a sharp, sudden pain shot through his body, piercing his chest like a needle. The room seemed to collapse around him. The walls twisted and warped, the symbols now bleeding, their red ink dripping like fresh blood. The floor beneath his feet gave way, and the air became thick with something foul, something ancient. He gasped for breath, but the air was heavy, like he was drowning in it. The whispers turned into voices, countless voices, overlapping and distorting until they formed a single command: feed. Seth's stomach churned as the hunger rose in him, strange, primal, a need that was not entirely his own. He could feel the taste of it, the need to feed, to consume something, anything. And in the chair before him, there was something, someone, waiting for him. It was a ghost A spectre, flickering in and out of reality, its form barely visible but undeniably present. The eyes, if they could even be called eyes, stared at him with a silent, knowing gaze. It did not beg. It did not plead. It simply waited. And for reasons Seth could not understand, he knew that this was the moment. This was the thing he had been waiting for, even if he didn't realize it until now. The ghost extended a hand, its fingers twisting and stretching unnaturally, as if reaching out from beyond the veil of life. Seth's mouth went dry, his throat constricting with an unfamiliar desire. Feed. The word echoed in his mind, the voice reverberating like a drumbeat in the depths of his consciousness. He could not stop himself. He had to do it. He had to take it in, consume it, swallow it whole. The hunger roared inside of him, louder than any fear. Without thinking, without hesitation, Seth leaned forward. The moment his lips touched the ghost's outstretched hand, the world exploded into light. The sensation was overwhelming, like a firestorm tearing through him, filling him with heat, power, and something far darker. The ghost's energy flooded his body, slipping down his throat, into his stomach, into his very soul. He gasped, the intensity of it nearly knocking him off his feet. It felt as though the ghost was seeping into him, becoming part of him, its essence intertwining with his own. His vision blurred, and for a fleeting moment, he felt someone, inside his mind, staring back at him, whispering things he could not understand. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The ghost was gone. The room was still. But Seth was not the same. His body felt different, stronger, lighter, yet somehow more empty. The hunger was still there, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness, pushing him forward, urging him to find more. Seth stood in the center of the room, panting, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers faded, leaving only the ringing silence, but now he understood it. It was the hunger that would never stop, the hunger that would drive him to seek more ghosts, more souls, more power. As he stepped back toward the door, which had once again unlocked itself, Seth could feel the weight of something ancient pressing on his soul. The house, with all its dark secrets, had awoken, and so had he. Chapter 1. The Hunger Awakens. Continued. The moment Seth left the room, a strange weight seemed to press down on him, as if the air itself had thickened. He staggered into the narrow hallway, still feeling the burn of the ghost's essence inside him. His body was humming, alive in a way it had never been before, and yet there was something deeply wrong. The hunger that had taken root in him was not just a physical sensation. It was as though it had carved its own place in his soul, a dark well that could never be filled. The door behind him slammed shut with a force that made the walls tremble. Seth whipped around, his pulse quickening, but there was nothing. No one. Just the house, silent, cold, and watching. He could feel it in the stillness, in the thick, almost suffocating silence that enveloped him. He was no longer alone here. The house had tasted him, and now it was hungry for more. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting, that the house was somehow alive, aware of his every step. The house seemed to know him. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet like the groan of an old man rising from bed, and the walls, cracked and decaying, seemed to lean in closer, listening. A voice, faint and far off, whispered through the silence. Feed. Seth's stomach lurched, and the hunger clawed at him again, more violently than before. It felt like a fire burning within him, relentless and unforgiving. His throat was dry, his head spinning, as though his mind was being torn apart by some dark force he couldn't comprehend. He needed to get out of here. His legs moved on their own, carrying him down the winding, narrow hallway, past rooms that he had never dared to explore. But the house was changing. The walls were shifting. The once familiar, musty scent of decay had given way to something else, something sweet, yet putrid, like rotting fruit. The hallway stretched out before him, growing longer with each step, pulling him deeper into the labyrinth of the house. The hunger grew with every breath. As he reached the end of the corridor, he saw another door. This one was different from the others. It was solid oak, dark and imposing, its surface smooth and unmarred by time. There was no handle, no keyhole. Just a smooth, polished surface that seemed to draw him in, as if it were waiting for him. Seth's hand reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cool wood. The sensation sent a shiver down his spine, a ripple of something ancient and sinister curling around his wrist, squeezing tight. "Feed," the voice whispered again, louder this time. The whisper seemed to come from all directions, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. It was no longer a distant murmur, but a demand, a command. His heart raced, and his breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what would happen if he opened this door, but he felt like he had no choice. Something deep within him told him that this was inevitable, that this house had chosen him, that this hunger was his now, and that it would never let him go. With a final hesitant breath, he pushed against the door. It opened with a sound like the creak of ancient hinges, and Seth stepped inside. The room was vast, larger than he had expected, its walls lined with shelves that stretched up into the shadows. The air inside was thick with dust, and the dim light from a single flickering bulb above cast long shadows across the room. But what truly caught his attention was what lay in the center of the room. A table. At first, Seth thought it was a simple wooden table, but as he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. The surface was slick with something dark and red, like blood. But it wasn't just the table that unsettled him. It was the items arranged neatly atop it. There were small jars, glass vessels filled with things that looked like preserved organs. Some human, some not. There were long, delicate strands of hair, coiled and twisted like spider silk. And in the center, on a crimson cloth, lay a single elongated object, a heart, still faintly pulsing. Seth's stomach churned as the hunger roared to life within him again. It felt like the room was alive, throbbing with a rhythm that matched the beat of his own heart. The heart on the table, his heart, began to beat faster, louder, as if it were calling to him. He stepped closer, his movements sluggish, as though he were in a dream. His fingers brushed the glass of one of the jars, and the hunger intensified, surging through him like a tidal wave. His breath came in short gasps, and he could feel the pressure building in his chest, his ribs aching as though they were being crushed by an unseen force. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer, as though it were standing behind him, whispering directly into his ear. "Take it, consume it, become one with it." The hunger, his hunger, surged again, and he reached out. His fingers closed around the jar containing the preserved eye of something that had once been human. It was cold to the touch, the glass smooth and unyielding. But inside, the eye, its dark pupil, stared back at him. It was alive. He didn't think. He couldn't think. His hand lifted the jar to his lips, his tongue flicking out, tasting the bitter metallic scent that clung to the air around him. He could feel it now, a presence pressing against him, watching him, guiding him. The second his lips touched the glass, a coldness surged through him. The hunger in his gut flared, an explosion of sensation that coursed through every inch of his body, flooding him with a rush of power. It was as though something had snapped inside him, some invisible thread breaking, and in that instant, everything changed. The room blurred, the shadows stretched longer, darker, until they reached out like tendrils, curling around his limbs. The whispers became screams, frantic and desperate, clawing at his mind. Seth dropped the jar, but it didn't matter. The thing inside the jar was inside him now. He could feel it, writhing in his veins, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The hunger didn't just stay in his stomach now, it was everywhere. His bones, his blood, his very soul was hungry. He could hear it, the gnawing, insatiable hunger that called to him from the dark corners of the house, the hunger that could never be sated, no matter how much he consumed. His eyes snapped open, and he saw her. A woman, a figure, standing in the doorway of the room, bathed in shadows. Her hair was long, dark, and tangled, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. She was smiling at him, But it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a smile that spoke of something far older, something far darker. "You've fed, Seth. Now you will never stop." Her voice was a song, soft and eerie, reverberating in his skull like the final note of a lullaby. The darkness around her seemed to grow, expanding and twisting, and Seth could feel it now. A presence, ancient and hungry, pressing in on him, claiming him. The woman took a step forward, her feet gliding across the floor as if she were floating. She reached out, and Seth could feel the coldness of her touch, the icy fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him closer. "You've tasted the hunger. And now," she whispered, her lips brushing his ear, "now, you are mine." Seth opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The hunger within him roared louder, drowning everything else, pulling him into the abyss where nothing was left but the insatiable need for more. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the woman's smile. A smile that promised no end. Chapter 2. The House Wakes. Seth could hear it before he saw it, the low, mournful creak of the floorboards echoing through the house, as though the very structure was groaning under the weight of something unseen. His footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet that covered the hallway, but still, the house seemed to whisper, calling him to go deeper, to unravel the secrets it had buried beneath layers of dust and time. He stopped at the base of the stairs, staring up at the darkened hallway above. A chill ran down his spine, but it wasn't the cold that bothered him. It was something else, a sense that the house had noticed him, that it was aware of his presence, as if the walls were watching, waiting for him to make a move. Seth swallowed, his throat dry as he felt the familiar pull again. The hunger. It was still there, gnawing at the back of his mind, urging him forward, but this time, it wasn't just an emptiness in his stomach. It was a craving, a burning need that stretched deep into his bones. Something ancient and hungry, like the roots of a tree spreading through his veins. With trembling fingers, he reached out for the banister, his hand brushing against the old wood. The texture was rough, aged, like the house itself, as if it had lived through centuries and yet still held some part of its original, terrible purpose. Seth closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, the thrum of blood that matched the pulsing rhythm of the house. He knew that he had no choice but to go on. The hunger wasn't something he could ignore. It was an all-consuming force that had begun to shape his every thought, every action. The more he resisted, the more it called to him, and the more he could feel himself losing control. He took the first step, and then another. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as though the house itself was testing him, waiting to see if he would continue or turn back. But there was no turning back. The upper floor was eerily silent. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, old wood, and something else, something darker, something he couldn't quite place. He passed the first few rooms, their doors shut tight, the faint outlines of what could have been once beautiful carvings visible through the cracks. Yet the silence was deafening, pressing down on him like an unseen weight, making his movements feel heavier, more labored. Then, just as he was about to pass another door, he heard it, a sound, faint at first, like the whisper of a long-forgotten memory. A voice. Seth. The sound of his name sent a shiver through him. He froze, every muscle tensed as he strained his ears. But the house was still. No more whispers, no more creaks. Only the unsettling quiet. Seth. This time, it was clearer. The voice came from behind the door directly in front of him, low and haunting, as though it were beckoning him from some distant place. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a wave of nausea washed over him. Something about that voice felt wrong, alive in a way that was impossible to explain. Slowly, cautiously, Seth reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. His fingers lingered for a moment, as though hesitating, but then the hunger stirred within him again. It was stronger now, more insistent. He had to know. He had to understand what was waiting for him inside. With a sharp breath, he turned the handle. The door creaked open. The room beyond was small, dimly lit by a single candle flickering weakly in the corner. The shadows danced across the walls like twisted figures, their forms shifting and changing with each flicker of light. The air inside was thick, dense, like it had been locked away for years, untouched by time or breath. And there, standing in the center of the room, was a figure, a woman. Her hair was long, black as midnight, falling in waves around her shoulders. She was dressed in an old, tattered gown that looked as though it had once been white, but was now stained with dirt and grime. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as though she were little more than a shadow, a spectre that had slipped through the cracks of the world. Her eyes, however, were the most unsettling part. They were wide, unblinking, and empty, pools of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Seth couldn't look away. He wanted to. He tried to. But her gaze held him captive, as if it were drawing him in, pulling him closer to her. "Seth," she whispered again, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You've come for me, haven't you?" Seth's mouth went dry, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes flicked around the room, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But all he saw were strange, indecipherable symbols carved into the walls, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. The woman took a step toward him, her movements unnaturally slow, as if the very act of walking caused her great strain. The shadows in the room seemed to move with her, curling around her like tendrils, clinging to her body. She smiled then, a twisted, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've already fed, Seth. Don't you know what that means?" Her voice was soft, almost coaxing, but there was something sharp in it, something cruel. Seth's legs trembled beneath him, his body rebelling against the pull of her gaze. He could feel the hunger inside him growing, bubbling up from deep within, clawing at his insides. You're... Seth's voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear. "What are you?" Her smile widened, and for a moment, Seth saw something else in her eyes, something that flickered with ancient malice, something that wasn't entirely human. "I am the hunger that waits." She spoke the words slowly, each one dripping with something sinister. "I am what lies beneath, what devours, what feeds on the lost and the forgotten. I am the house's hunger, Seth, and now I am yours." Before he could react, the shadows in the room rushed toward him, coiling around his legs, his arms, binding him in place. The air grew colder, and Seth's breath turned to mist in front of him. The woman stepped closer, and her hand, cold and clammy, reached out, brushing against his cheek. The hunger inside him screamed in protest, desperate to escape, to feed, to consume whatever was in front of him. Seth's body convulsed with the force of it, his stomach twisting with the unbearable need. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, raw. The woman's lips hovered near his ear, and she whispered once more, "You will never be free of me, Seth. You will never be free of the hunger." And as she spoke those words, the walls of the room seemed to collapse inward, the shadows closing in, suffocating him, drowning him in a flood of blackness. The last thing Seth saw before the darkness overtook him was her smile, stretching wider and wider, until it consumed everything. Chapter 3: The Feast of Shadows. Seth woke in darkness. The kind of darkness that felt thick, pressing down on him from all sides, suffocating. His lungs burned as if they had forgotten how to breathe, and for a few moments he lay still, disoriented, his senses struggling to reclaim their hold on reality. His body was cold, but not in the natural way. It was a deep, unnatural cold, like the chill that comes with death, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there long after the world around you has warmed. He could feel it biting at his skin, gnawing at him. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as though they were trapped in some unseen force, bound by something far beyond physical restraint. Panic surged through him, and he attempted to push himself up from the floor, but his fingers met something soft, sticky, wet even. His heart skipped a beat. The room was still black, save for the faint flicker of something ahead, in the distance. A light? No, not a light. There was something more ethereal about it, something strange. The flickering wasn't warm. It was cold, like the pulse of some dark energy. Seth's breathing came in quick, shallow gasps. He felt something brush against his cheek. A cold breeze, maybe, or something else. Something that wasn't wind at all. The hunger was there again, gnawing at the back of his mind, feeding off his fear. Seth clutched at his stomach, willing the gnawing sensation to stop, but it wouldn't. It never would. He strained his eyes in the direction of the flicker, focusing as best as he could. The sensation of being trapped intensified as his gaze fixed on a shadowy shape that seemed to shift with every beat of his heart. It was tall, imposing, and although it was wrapped in darkness, Seth could feel its eyes upon him. There was no mistaking the coldness that emanated from it, nor the strange tugging sensation deep inside him. Suddenly, the darkness in the room seemed to come alive. The shadows moved, shifting and swirling around him like some kind of living entity. Seth's breath caught in his throat. It was as though the darkness was feeding on his fear, swelling with each terrified heartbeat, until the entire room felt suffocating, a prison made of nothing but darkness and dread. Seth. The whisper again, that same voice. So faint, so close. He could feel it in his ears, sliding into his mind like a knife. It was the voice of the woman. No, the thing that had beckoned him here, and she was not finished with him yet. I told you, you would never be free. The shadow moved again, this time closer, until Seth could almost feel the pressure of its presence against his skin, as if it were standing right next to him, its breath hot against his ear. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, every inch of him screaming to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room was alive with an unnatural hum, a sickening pulse, and he could feel the hunger inside of him intensify. It was almost as if it had become a separate entity, feeding off the fear, the anxiety, the growing terror that was coursing through his veins. Seth tried to steady his breath, his pulse racing, but his body wouldn't obey. The pull was too strong, like a tide dragging him further out into a sea of madness. The voice spoke again, but this time it was different, more insistent, more demanding. You know why you're here. You know what you are. You are mine, Seth. I've been waiting for you. Seth's eyes darted around, but the shadows were so thick that he could barely make out shapes. The air was thick with an oppressive force that weighed heavily on his chest, making it hard to breathe, as though something was constricting his lungs, his heart. He could feel his pulse pounding in his throat, louder now, each beat a reminder of what was happening, what was coming. The floor beneath him creaked. And then, just when he thought he might lose his mind, the first scream broke through the silence. It was soft at first, almost muffled, but then it grew louder, longer, until it seemed to be coming from all around him. A woman's scream, high-pitched and desperate, a cry for help that turned into a shrill, gut-wrenching wail. It cut through the suffocating air like a knife, and Seth could feel the walls of the room closing in around him, as if the house itself was breathing, its walls trembling with the force of the scream. The shadow moved again, and this time Seth saw something in the corner of his eye. A shape, no, a figure, rising from the darkness. It was human-shaped, but it was wrong. It wasn't quite human. It was too tall, too twisted, its limbs elongated and grotesque. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but Seth could feel its eyes on him, staring, waiting for something. You will feed, the voice whispered. It wasn't just the woman anymore. It was them. All of them. The hungry souls that had been trapped here, waiting to be consumed. Seth's body screamed in protest as the hunger took control. His mouth opened of its own accord, his teeth grinding together, as if they too were hungry. A taste of something foul and dark slid down his throat, coating it like a film, thick and sickly. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with life, and a grotesque, twisted figure began to take shape, a distorted silhouette that loomed over him. The whispers grew louder, the voices all merging into one, a cacophony of torment, each word digging deeper into his consciousness. You are the one who will feast. You are the one we have chosen. Taste what has been denied. And then the figure lunged. Seth could not move. He could not scream. All he could do was feel. The cold fingers of the figure were upon him, clawing at his skin, dragging him into the darkness. His vision went black, the hunger swallowing him whole, pulling him into the void where there was no escape, no release, only endless consumption. He felt something within him snap, a part of his soul breaking loose, a feeling of hunger unlike anything he had ever known before, deeper, darker, more insatiable. The walls around him seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart, as if the house itself were alive, feeding off the terror that radiated from him. The thing that stood above him, they who had waited for him, were hungry too, and in the darkness they feasted together. Chapter 3: The Feast of Shadows, continued. Seth's mind reeled as he tried to understand what was happening to him. The room, if it could even be called a room, was alive in a way he couldn't describe. It was as though the very walls themselves were breathing, pulsing with some dark energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him, like a physical force, suffocating him, making his breaths shallow and ragged. The figure in the distance seemed to beckon him, but not with words. No, the figure, if it could even be called that, communicated in a far more insidious way. It wasn't a voice that he heard, but a thought, an instinct that whispered through the very fabric of his being. Come closer. You cannot escape. You are already part of this place. The hunger gnawed at him, growing more insistent with each passing second. It was like an invisible hand wrapped around his stomach, twisting, pulling. His body felt weak, trembling as he fought the urge to give in, to succumb to the pull of whatever force was drawing him deeper into the darkness. But there was something more, something far worse lurking behind the insatiable hunger. Seth's eyes darted around the room, seeking something, anything that could offer him an escape. But there was nothing, nothing but the oppressive blackness and the silent, creeping presence of the figure that watched him. It wasn't just watching him, though. It was feeding on him, on his fear, on his uncertainty. The shadows that surrounded him moved, shifting and swirling in the corner of his vision. They had a life of their own, like writhing tendrils of smoke, or the movements of some otherworldly creature. Every so often, Seth could have sworn he saw something moving within the shadows, something just out of sight, something too fast to track. It was as though the shadows themselves had minds of their own, and they were closing in on him, tightening their grip. His pulse quickened, the hunger. It was all consuming now. There was no escaping it. It was like an animal clawing its way up from the depths of his stomach, dragging him toward a dark, empty hole within him that he had no way of filling. He could feel the floor beneath him shift, groaning as though the very foundation of the house were alive. The walls seemed to stretch and contort, their angles becoming warped, their edges bleeding into the air. The room was no longer solid. It was fluid, mutable, like a living nightmare that bent and twisted with every passing moment. Seth pressed his hands to his face, trying to block out the noise that was building around him. The whispers, those soft, insidious voices, were louder now, crawling into his thoughts, tugging at the edges of his sanity. He could hear them clearly now, not as a distant hum, but as if they were right in his ear, circling around him like vultures. "You can't escape," one of them whispered, a voice full of venom and darkness. "You never could." His heart hammered in his chest, the fear swallowing him whole. His mouth was dry, and his throat constricted, as though he were choking on something thick and viscous. His hands shook as he tried to push himself off the ground, but the more he moved, the more the shadows seemed to cling to him, wrapping around his limbs like the cold, clammy fingers of death. The temperature in the room plummeted. Seth could see his breath in front of him now, misting in the oppressive air. Cold, unnatural cold that bit through his clothes and into his bones. The kind of cold that felt ancient, as though it had been waiting here for centuries, watching, listening, waiting for him. And then he heard it again, the scream. It came from behind him this time, from the farthest corner of the room, a tortured, shrill cry, full of agony and fear. It was the kind of scream that made his skin crawl, the kind that left a mark on the soul. He whipped his head around, but the shadows swallowed everything in sight, leaving nothing but the oppressive blackness. The scream died out, replaced by an eerie silence. But this silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The air felt thick with something unspeakable, something that Seth couldn't put into words. His body was shaking uncontrollably now, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. But he couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop searching for some way out. The flickering light in the distance caught his attention again, the same strange, cold light that seemed to dance and waver, never fully illuminating anything. It beckoned him. He could feel it pulling him deeper into the darkness. And then he saw it, a figure. Tall, thin, its face obscured in shadow. It wasn't quite human, not fully, but there was something disturbingly familiar about it. It was standing at the far end of the room, unmoving, watching him, waiting. Seth's heart raced as he took a step toward it, then another. Each step felt like it took an eternity, as though the ground itself was fighting him, pulling him back. But he couldn't stop. He had to reach it. He had to know. The figure in the distance seemed to flicker, its shape becoming clearer with each passing moment. But the more Seth moved toward it, the more the shadows seemed to stretch out and engulf the figure, until it was once again obscured in darkness. But the hunger was still there. It was insistent, unbearable. He could feel it gnawing at him, tearing him apart from the inside. It was as if the room itself was feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every thought of escape, every attempt to resist. As he reached the spot where the figure had been standing, the air grew colder still. His breath fogged in front of him, thick and oppressive. The shadows seemed to shift around him, coiling like serpents. He turned slowly, half expecting to see something lurking in the corner of his vision. But there was nothing. Nothing but the weight of the darkness pressing in. And then, without warning, the floor beneath him gave way. Seth's body plummeted, and for a moment, there was only darkness. The rush of air, the sensation of falling, of weightlessness, consumed him. But the falling never ended. It stretched on and on, until it felt as though he were falling through some kind of endless void. And then he landed, not with a crash, but with a soft, sickening thud, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. He lay there for a moment, stunned, his chest heaving with the effort to breathe. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the room. He was in a place that felt far worse, a place where time didn't exist, where shadows moved and whispered without reason. The ground beneath him was soft, almost organic, like the inside of a grave. The walls were made of dark, shifting smoke, and the air was thick with a stench that made his stomach turn. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, though he saw no one. "Welcome," a voice whispered. Seth's blood ran cold. He couldn't tell where the voice came from, but it felt like it was inside his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, suffocating him. "You've come for the feast," the voice continued, the words curling into his mind like a noxious cloud. "You're not alone here. We've been waiting. All of us." And with that, Seth knew he was trapped. Not just in this place, but in a fate that was already written. The hunger was no longer just his own. It belonged to the shadows, the things that lurked just beyond the edges of his vision. And it would never stop. Chapter 4: The Hollow Echo. Seth's mind drifted in and out of consciousness like a ragged sail caught in an invisible storm. Each time he blinked, the world around him seemed to shift, morphing into something more sinister, more suffocating. He could no longer tell where the darkness ended and the shadows began. There was no light to anchor him, no solid ground beneath his feet. All he knew was the overwhelming sensation of being watched, and that gnawing, insatiable hunger. It was something primal, something born from the depths of his very soul, stretching and clawing its way out of him. The air was thick, wet, and choked with a metallic stench. It was the scent of rot, decay that lingered in every breath he took. It was the smell of something long dead, something that had been forgotten by time and buried beneath the weight of centuries. Seth opened his eyes again, and the world around him folded and contorted like a canvas being stretched by unseen hands. The walls, once solid and unyielding, seemed to breathe in and out, expanding and contracting with each pulse of his heart. This place was not real. He knew it wasn't. Nothing felt solid. The floor beneath his feet shifted as though it were made of something soft and unstable. His hands pressed into the ground, finding nothing but an endless void that whispered of death and despair. He forced himself to stand, though every muscle in his body screamed in protest. The shadows in this place seemed to stretch out before him, reaching, pulling. He stumbled forward, his legs trembling beneath him, unsure whether it was from the weight of the hunger or the suffocating pressure of the void. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to look away, to make a mistake. And that's when he saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling mist, a shape appeared. At first it was nothing more than a blur, an outline shifting in the periphery of his vision. But as he stepped closer, it solidified into a figure, a man, or something that resembled one. His features were obscured by the same inky blackness that shrouded the room, but Seth could feel the weight of his gaze. It was as though the man was looking right through him, not at him, but into him, into the very core of his being. Seth froze. The figure did not move. He simply stood there, in the center of the room, his head slightly tilted, as though studying Seth with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The hunger. It was becoming unbearable now, clawing at him, pulling him toward that figure. Seth took a step back, his mind racing. His chest tightened as he realized, with a sinking dread, that he was being drawn toward it, like a moth to a flame, even though every part of him screamed to flee. Suddenly the man spoke, but not with his mouth. It was as if the words slid into Seth's mind, cold and smooth, like a blade slicing through flesh. "You have arrived," the voice echoed, the sound reverberating through the hollow space. "And you are already too late." Seth's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, freezing him in place. The hunger gnawed harder now, consuming his thoughts, his very will. The man's form blurred again, twisting into something else. Seth couldn't understand what he was seeing. A shifting mass of shapes, a swirling collection of limbs and faces, all twisted together in a grotesque parody of humanity. No, this wasn't just a man. It wasn't even human. It was something far worse, something ancient, born from the depths of the void, something that had fed on fear for millennia. Seth's stomach lurched. The hunger was unbearable now, gnawing at him, clawing at the inside of his chest. He could feel it, like a vacuum, a black hole pulling him in. The walls, the floor, the air, it was all a part of it, feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every second. "You are not the first," the voice said again, its coldness wrapping around Seth like a vice. "Many have come before you. They have walked the same path, felt the same hunger, and yet—" The voice trailed off, the last words sinking into the space between Seth's thoughts like a heavy weight. And still, they remain. The room seemed to warp around him. The walls stretched, the floor buckled, and the air thickened to the point of suffocation. Seth's breath came in short gasps, his body trembling, unable to stand against the force pulling at him. The hunger was now an abyss inside him, an endless void that threatened to consume him whole. It was calling him. Suddenly the figure, the thing, moved. It was a blur, a speed beyond human comprehension, and before Seth could react, it was upon him. The coldness of its presence hit him like an avalanche, overwhelming his senses, smothering him. He couldn't see its face. No, there was no face, only a void where it should have been. But he could feel it. It was feeding. A hand, if it could even be called a hand, reached out, brushing against Seth's skin. The touch was ice, freezing him from the inside out. He wanted to scream, but no sound would escape his throat. The hunger inside him was worse than anything he had ever known, an agony beyond description. It tore through him like fire, like 1,000 needles stabbing through his veins. The thing was feeding off him, using his fear to grow stronger, to become something more. "You are mine," the voice whispered, the words sinking deeper into Seth's mind, marking him. "We all are. You will feed us. You will never leave. Not now. Not ever." Seth's vision blurred as the world seemed to collapse around him. The floor cracked beneath him, splitting wide open, as though the very earth was ready to swallow him whole. The shadows stretched out, clawing at him, pulling him down into the abyss. And then, everything went black. Char de peu. When Seth woke, it was as though time itself had stopped. The world around him had changed. He could feel it in the air, the palpable presence of something watching, something waiting. It was cold here, colder than before. But now he could hear something, a soft murmur in the distance. It wasn't clear at first, just whispers, faint and soft, like a distant crowd murmuring behind a wall. But then the whispers grew louder, sharper. They were speaking to him, calling him. His chest tightened with dread. It wasn't over. The hunger was still there, but now it had become something else, something far worse. It wasn't just an ache, a gnawing feeling anymore. No, it was a presence, a dark, terrible thing that had rooted itself inside him. It was as if the thing had become a part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being. It followed him, like a shadow that never left. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking. The air around him was thick with that same rancid, metallic smell. The walls seemed to close in, and the ground beneath him quaked. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last, but the whispers grew louder. Come closer. Join us. Seth turned, his body moving against his will, as though his very essence was being pulled. His eyes flicked to the shadows ahead, and he saw them. Faces, twisted, distorted, contorted with pain and hunger. They were in the walls, in the floor, and in the air. Eyes stared back at him from the darkness, cold and hollow, yet filled with a sickening desire. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure. A man, or something that looked like a man. Standing in the distance, watching him. Seth could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his blood running cold. He knew who this was. It was the thing, the entity that had been watching him since the moment he had set foot in this cursed place. But now it was different. Now it wasn't just a shadow. It was a part of him, and it was hungry. Chapter 5. The Taste of Eternity. The void was vast, stretching infinitely in every direction, as though the very laws of reality had been forgotten, cast aside like brittle parchment in a forgotten corner. Seth's senses screamed at him, but his body had stopped responding. He was trapped in a world that no longer obeyed any logic, where time held no meaning, and space was a collapsing, ever-shifting nightmare. He wasn't sure how much time had passed since he had first stepped into this place. His body had grown numb, disconnected from itself, as though it were no longer his. The hunger still gnawed at him, though it had taken on a new, insidious form. It wasn't just a craving anymore. It was a part of him, a parasite, a constant, gnawing presence that had burrowed deep inside, taking root in his very soul. Seth's thoughts felt disjointed, broken. They flickered like a dying flame, brief moments of clarity followed by bursts of confusion and panic. His chest tightened, his breathing shallow and uneven. He wanted to scream, but the sound died before it could escape his throat. No matter how hard he fought, he couldn't free himself from the thing that had taken hold of him. The whispers, those endless, maddening whispers, never stopped. They surrounded him, filled the air, burrowed deep into his mind. Come closer, Seth. The voice slithered inside his skull, smooth like oil, cold like death. Come closer and taste. He didn't know what it meant. Taste what? What had he become? The walls around him seemed to pulse, undulating like the surface of a body that had never been touched by light. They were slick, damp to the touch, as though they were alive. No, that wasn't right. He could feel them, feel the pulse beneath his fingers, hear them throb like a heartbeat. Each thrum reverberated through his bones, vibrating in his skull. The walls were not just walls, they were an extension of the entity itself, breathing, waiting. The figure, the one that had been stalking him for what felt like an eternity, was gone. But Seth could still feel its presence, its eyes watching him from every corner of the abyss. It was in the air, in the very fabric of this place. And then, Just as he thought he might be alone, the silence shattered. A sound, faint at first but growing louder, reached his ears. It was a low, rhythmic noise, like a distant hum or a whispering chant. The sound wasn't just in the air. No, it came from inside him. It was the hunger. A relentless, gnawing ache that radiated from deep within his chest, spreading outwards like a fire. It was demanding. It was demanding that he feed. But there was nothing to feed on. Not in this forsaken place. No food. No sustenance. Just the raw, empty void of the unknown. Seth sank to his knees, the weight of it all crashing down on him, his eyes blurred. The darkness closing in like a storm. It felt as if the world itself was spinning, folding inward, drawing him into its suffocating grip. And then, the floor cracked beneath him. The sound of it, the sickening crack of stone splitting open, was like a death knell, resonating in the very marrow of his bones. Seth looked down, and what he saw made his blood freeze. The ground beneath him was opening up, a chasm forming in the center of the room. The blackness poured out from the fissures, a thick, liquid darkness that oozed from the cracks like blood from a wound. It swirled around him, a dark tide, rising and falling like the pulse of some ancient beast beneath the earth. Seth tried to move, but his body betrayed him. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if they were encased in thick, unyielding chains. The hunger was unbearable, gnawing at his insides, eating him from the inside out. His gaze snapped back to the chasm, and in that moment, he saw them. Faces, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. Eyes staring up from the depths, their pupils wide and dark. Endless pits that reflected nothing but a void. They were like him, or they had been. They had come before him, drawn to the same hunger, to the same insatiable desire. But now, they were nothing more than empty vessels, soulless, their flesh twisted into grotesque mockeries of human form. Their mouths opened in unison, a chorus of silent screams that sent a chill through Seth's bones. They were calling to him, beckoning him closer. The hunger inside him stirred, surged, and he felt himself being drawn toward the chasm, toward the endless yawning abyss where he, too, would join them. "No," Seth breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Please." But the darkness had already claimed him. Chapter 5, The Taste of Eternity, Part 1. The walls were alive. Seth had known this truth for what felt like years, though time, in this place, was an illusion. The pulse of the walls was like a heartbeat, thumping slowly, deeply, reverberating through the floors beneath him, a rhythm that began to invade his very thoughts. They were alive, breathing, watching, waiting. He could feel it now, more acutely than before. The hunger, it was a gnawing ache that had crept into his very bones, so deep it couldn't be dismissed as something so simple as a desire for food. No, this hunger was more insidious. It was the hunger of the soul, the gnawing emptiness of a creature starving not for sustenance, but for something more profound, for eternity. The dim, flickering lights that hung like broken stars overhead cast long shadows across the cold stone floor, the only source of illumination in this suffocating expanse. Seth's mind had already wandered to the point where he could no longer remember the faces of those he had loved. His mother, his friends, his family. The edges of their images had blurred, fading into the same fog of uncertainty that clouded everything around him. He stumbled down the endless corridor, his footsteps dragging on the wet stone, echoing off the walls that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a pungent mix of dampness and rot. Each breath he took seemed to pull more of the stench into his lungs, but it was familiar. It was the scent of this place, of the abyss he had willingly stepped into. The hunger was worse now. It burned inside him, spreading like wildfire. It clawed at his throat, gnawing at his stomach, twisting and contorting his insides. It was all-consuming, all-encompassing. He could feel it reaching deeper, burrowing into his very soul, demanding satisfaction in a way he couldn't begin to comprehend. It called to him, that hunger, a voice deep within his mind that whispered his name like a lover's caress. Seth, it beckoned. slithering through his thoughts like liquid darkness. Come closer. Come to me. I will give you what you crave. The walls around him shifted, groaning as they pressed inward. Seth felt them, the way the stones seemed to tighten around him, the air growing thicker, more suffocating. His heart raced, his breathing quickening, but he couldn't stop. His legs were moving on their own, pushing him forward, deeper into the maze of shadows. The whispers, those maddening whispers, were growing louder. It was as if the very walls were speaking to him, calling him into their depths, pulling him closer to whatever lay beyond. And in his soul, in the deepest corners of his mind, Seth knew what waited for him. It was not a place of salvation. No, this was not a place to find peace. It was a place where the hunger lived, where it thrived. It was a place where the eternity of his existence would be filled with nothing but the gnawing need for more. For what? More food? More souls? He didn't know. The answer was lost in the blackness, lost in the depths of the shadows that crept around him, whispering his name. Seth could feel his pulse in his throat, pounding so violently he thought it might break his neck. Every nerve in his body screamed for release, for escape, but there was no escape from this place, no escape from the hunger that had claimed him. He was bound here, tied to the darkness by threads of his own making. The thing that had followed him, the thing that had first whispered to him in the quiet hours of the night, had now become an undeniable part of him. As he moved deeper into the corridor, the walls began to tremble, and Seth felt the floor beneath his feet shift, the stone beneath him cracking and groaning like the sound of bones breaking. His breath caught in his chest, his throat tight with dread. Something was coming. Something wrong. A low rumble filled the air, deep and guttural, like the growl of an ancient beast awakening from its slumber. The whispers reached a fever pitch, surrounding him, drowning him in their cold, hollow voices. Seth's hands shot out, grasping at the air, desperate for anything to hold on to. And then, nothing. The rumble stopped. The whispers fell silent. For a moment, there was only the heavy, oppressive silence of the place. Seth's heartbeat pounded in his ears, and he realized he was no longer alone. He spun around, eyes wide, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing, only darkness. Only the gnawing ache inside him that seemed to grow with every passing second. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was nothing more than a silhouette at first, shrouded in the darkness, a mere suggestion of shape. But as it stepped forward, its form began to solidify, and Seth's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, or something that had once been a man. His face was gaunt, stretched tight over a skull too small for its hollow eyes. His body was emaciated, skin hanging from his bones like tattered rags. But it was the eyes that held Seth's gaze, two pits of blackness that seemed to absorb all light, all hope. There was no soul behind them, only a void. Seth staggered backward, fear rising like a tide. The figure did not move. It stood there, its head tilted slightly, its hollow eyes fixed on him, as though it were studying him. You're one of them," Seth whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, and the hunger inside Seth surged to the surface. It burned in his chest, a searing pain that spread like wildfire. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs were frozen. His body betrayed him. The figure's mouth opened, revealing a blackened, cavernous throat that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. From the depths of that throat came a low, eerie laugh, a sound like bones scraping against each other, like the death rattle of a long-forgotten corpse. Seth's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears, but he could not look away. He was transfixed, caught in the figure's gaze, as if some invisible force held him in place. And then, the figure spoke. "You were always meant to be here." The words were like ice, freezing Seth's blood in his veins. He wanted to ask, to scream, to beg for answers, but his voice was lost in his throat. The hunger, the ache inside him. It was too much. It consumed him. The figure stepped forward again, its movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Seth could feel the pull of its presence, the way the darkness seemed to bend around it, pulling him closer, deeper into the abyss. You'll feed too, just like the rest of us. Chapter 6. The Silent Feast. The house was a mausoleum. It had once been alive with light and laughter, but now it stood like a broken monument to a forgotten past. Its windows darkened with the stain of time. The wind whispered through the cracked windows, howling in the hollow emptiness that had swallowed it whole. Seth could feel the chill creeping up his spine as he stepped inside, his feet barely making a sound on the cold, dust-ridden floor. The air was thick, stifling, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. He was alone. Or so he thought. His fingers brushed against the splintering walls, the paint peeling like old skin, revealing the scars of a history long buried. Every step he took seemed to echo in the silence, a constant reminder of the emptiness that had overtaken the once vibrant place. He knew this house. He had grown up in it. It was his home once, but now it felt foreign, twisted, as if the very essence of it had been corrupted by something he couldn't understand. The walls groaned under the weight of memories, creaking like the bones of some ancient, decaying creature. Seth's throat tightened as he passed the old family portraits hanging crookedly on the walls. Their glass cracked, their colors faded into something grotesque. The eyes of his ancestors, his parents, his grandparents, seemed to follow him as he moved, their gazes haunting, accusing. He stopped at the foot of the staircase, the one that led up to the attic. The place where it had all started, the place where everything had gone wrong. Seth had avoided the attic for years, ever since that night. The night when the hunger first came. But tonight, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The pull was too strong, too overwhelming. He had to go back. He had to understand what had happened. What had changed him. Seth reached for the old brass doorknob at the bottom of the stairs, its surface tarnished with age. He turned it slowly, the creaking of the door sending a shiver down his spine. The attic door groaned open, revealing the darkness beyond. He could feel it, the heavy weight of the air, thick with the dust of forgotten years, the musty scent of rot that clung to everything. The staircase led upward in a narrow, twisting spiral, the steps creaking under his weight. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, denser. He felt the darkness closing in around him, the walls pressing in from all sides. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting, and deep within it, something stirred, something ancient, something hungry. At the top of the stairs, Seth hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the attic door. He could hear it now, the faintest sound, like a whispering voice, curling through the darkness. It was so soft, so faint, that at first he thought it was just his imagination. But then, it came again. Seth. The voice was low, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It was a whisper that echoed through the very marrow of his bones, a voice that seemed to resonate deep within his soul. His name. Seth, come closer. His pulse quickened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He knew that voice. But how? Before he could question it further, the door before him creaked open, as if inviting him inside. The attic was the same as it had always been, yet different. The dust that had once settled on the old wooden beams now seemed to have grown thicker, more suffocating. Shadows clung to the corners, twisting and stretching in unnatural shapes, as if the very darkness had taken on a life of its own. Seth stepped into the room, his boots scraping against the wooden floorboards. He could feel the air around him shift, the temperature dropping sharply as he crossed the threshold. The whispers grew louder now, swirling around him, soft yet insistent. He tried to ignore them, but the sound of his name being repeated over and over again gnawed at his sanity. Seth. He turned toward the far corner of the attic, where an old wooden chest stood, its lid slightly ajar. The chest had been there for as long as Seth could remember. His parents had always told him not to touch it. It had always been off-limits, forbidden, a relic of some past they had never spoken of. But tonight, the chest called to him. With hesitant steps, Seth moved toward it, the floor groaning under his weight. As he reached out to open the lid, a wave of nausea washed over him, the smell of something rotting, something decaying, hit him like a physical blow. He recoiled for a moment, his stomach churning, but the pull was irresistible. He had to know. He lifted the lid slowly, carefully, and as it creaked open, a flood of darkness seemed to pour from within, spilling out into the room like some liquid shadow. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and Seth's chest tightened, the weight of something ancient pressing down on him. Inside the chest, beneath the thick layers of dust and decay, something moved. It was a figure, or at least, what had once been a figure. It was human, partially, but it was twisted, deformed, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. Its face was barely recognizable. The skin stretched tight over its skull, its eyes hollow and black, staring up at Seth as if it had been waiting for him all this time. Seth staggered back, his heart racing in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the sound of his own breath, ragged and desperate. But then, the thing in the chest moved. Slowly, painfully, as if it were fighting against some unseen force. Its hands reached out toward him, the fingers long and bony, the nails sharp and claw-like. "Seth!" the thing rasped, its voice a hollow, tortured whisper. It was a voice that was all too familiar. Seth's eyes widened as he realized, with a growing horror, that the thing in the chest was him, or, more accurately, it had been. The thing in the chest was his reflection. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with such force that it left him gasping for air. This was the truth he had been running from. This was the reason the hunger had claimed him. The reason it had followed him all these years. It was not the house, not the curse. It was him. His hand trembled as he reached out toward the figure, drawn to it against his will. But as his fingers brushed the rotting skin of his own reflection, something snapped within him. The hunger surged to the surface, a violent, feral need that tore through him with an intensity he could not control. Without warning, Seth let out a guttural scream, his body convulsing as the hunger overwhelmed him. His teeth ached, his stomach twisted into knots, and he felt something inside him break. Something snapped in his soul. He needed to feed. He had always needed to feed. And now, it was too late. The darkness had taken root. Chapter 6. The Silent Feast continued. Seth's world twisted as the hunger took hold. The thing in the chest, his own decayed reflection, seemed to smile, a grotesque, hollow grin stretching across its rotting face. The darkness in the attic seemed to pulse, alive with a rhythm, a heartbeat that Seth could not escape. The room spun as his body shook with the force of his own craving. The pain in his stomach, deep and gnawing, was unbearable. The hunger was no longer a mere sensation. It was an entity, a ravenous, insatiable force that consumed everything it touched. Seth's body began to tremble violently, his hands clawing at his face, at his throat, as if he could rip away the source of the torment. But the thing inside him, inside his very soul, would not let him go. I can't, Seth whispered through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with both terror and desperation. He was losing himself. He could feel it. The hunger, the craving. It had always been a part of him. A shadow that followed, that whispered to him in his darkest moments. But now, it was more than just a whisper. It was a roar. The attic around him darkened further, the shadows stretching and twisting like hungry hands reaching for him. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath was a battle. Every pulse in his veins seemed to drag him deeper into the void. His body felt foreign, like an instrument playing a tune he could no longer control. The pulse in his head was deafening, his eyes fixed on the rotting form in the chest, the reflection of his own self, still reaching out with skeletal hands. But it was not the hunger alone that haunted him. It was the faces that had been left behind. The faces of those he had consumed. The whispers were growing louder now, like a chorus rising from the depths of hell itself. Their voices mingled with his reflection's voice, making it impossible to distinguish where one ended and the other began. They were all there, his mother, his father, his friends, the strangers he had devoured in those dark, ravenous nights. They were still there. You were never meant to feed on us, a voice echoed in the back of his mind. It was his father's voice, deep, disappointed, and final. The very air around Seth seemed to hum with an unearthly power, reverberating through the rafters, as though the house itself was alive, sharing in his torment. You were never meant to become this. Seth's breath caught in his throat. The reflection's eyes widened, its lips peeling back into a grotesque grin. The reflection shifted, morphing into something new, something even darker. It was now standing, no longer confined to the chest, looming above Seth like a nightmare come to life. It stepped toward him. "It's too late now, Seth," the thing rasped, its voice a sickening whisper that echoed off the walls. "You've crossed the threshold. You've fed, and you will feed again. You cannot escape the hunger. You cannot escape yourself." Seth's legs gave way beneath him. He crumpled to the floor, his hands clutching at his stomach, as though trying to hold it together. His head throbbed, and for a moment, he could feel the edges of his reality slipping away. The room was no longer the attic. It was something darker, deeper, a void that stretched on endlessly, a place where time and space had no meaning. The walls seemed to breathe around him, expanding and contracting with each breath. He could see it now, no longer just the figure in the chest, but the entire house, the twisted reflection of his life. The hunger had seeped into everything. Every corner of the house was stained with it. Every room soaked in the residue of his sins. He had fed here, he had taken, and the house had borne witness. But it was more than just the house. It was a part of him now. Seth lifted his head, his eyes wide with realization. You can't run from what you are. The voice was not his own. It was a chorus of voices now, all of them overlapping, blurring into one another, as though the very essence of the house had become a part of him, a part of the hunger. He could hear the walls crackle, the ceiling groan under the weight of its own secrets. The house was alive. The house was feeding on him, just as he had fed on others. The cycle was endless, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed him completely. He stood up shakily, still clutching his stomach, his eyes darting to the attic door. He knew he couldn't stay here any longer. He needed to leave. He had to escape this place before it consumed him entirely. But the reflection, his reflection, was already moving toward him, its arms outstretched, reaching for him with terrible precision. The hunger in its eyes was unmistakable. You are the feast now, the reflection said, its voice cold and final. Seth turned and stumbled toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps as he reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling with desperation. He yanked it open, but before he could take a step, the air around him grew still. The whispers stopped. Seth. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was loud, so loud it shook his bones. The darkness around him seemed to surge forward, filling his vision, pulling him back into the depths. He tried to scream, but his voice was stolen from him, swallowed whole by the void that was consuming the very air. In an instant, the reflection was upon him, its hands closing around his throat, squeezing with a strength that no human could possess. Seth gasped for air, his body convulsing in the grip of the thing that had once been him. You can never escape the hunger. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating in the dark corners of his soul. Seth could feel the tendrils of darkness wrapping around his body, pulling him down into an abyss that had no end. The hunger, the twisted, ravenous force that had haunted him for so long, was now all that remained. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the reflection's face, a grotesque parody of his own, smiling cruelly. And then, nothing. Chapter 7. The Unspoken Promise. The shadows in the house had begun to breathe again. Seth's world, once a twisted reflection of his own hunger, had grown even darker. The feeling of being watched, of being followed by unseen eyes, had become unbearable. The house had changed. It was no longer the silent, decaying mausoleum it had once been. It was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that seeped through the cracks in the walls, into his bones, and deep into the marrow of his soul. He had tried to leave. Oh, how he had tried. Each time he reached the door, the cold iron handle would twist in his grip, impossibly heavy, dragging him back into the heart of the darkness that awaited him. It was as if the house itself were mocking him, toying with his desperation. Seth had long since given up on the idea of escape. He could feel the hunger coursing through him, infecting his thoughts, twisting his desires. It was no longer just a need. It was an obligation. It was a curse that bound him to the house, to the walls that seemed to hum with a quiet malice. The attic had become his refuge and his prison. At night, the house came alive in ways he couldn't explain. The creaks of the floorboards became whispers. The shifting of the shadows became something almost sentient, watching him, waiting for the moment when he would break. The reflection in the old, cracked mirror no longer looked like him. It had taken on its own life, its own dark purpose. Each night, Seth would stare into the mirror, and each time, the figure on the other side would smile. It was an unsettling, cruel smile, one that promised both salvation and doom in equal measure. He had learned the truth. The house did not just want him to feed. It wanted him to become one with it, to accept its dark covenant, to surrender to the hunger that had driven him from the very beginning. But what was the hunger? What had it truly meant when it whispered to him, beckoning him toward that first taste, that first forbidden bite? What was it that had possessed him, transformed him into something less than human, more than monster? The questions gnawed at him, driving him to madness. One evening, as the house seemed to hum with an unnatural stillness, Seth ventured down the narrow hallway that led to the basement. The steps creaked underfoot, as though they too were alive, warning him not to tread further into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder the deeper he went, the darkness thickening, pressing against him from all sides. At the bottom of the stairs he paused, looking down at the door that stood before him. It was old, covered in dust and grime, the wood worn and splintered from years of disuse. The brass handle gleamed in the dim light, as if calling to him, urging him to turn it, to open the door. He hesitated, a cold sweat gathering on his brow. He had never dared to enter the basement before. There had always been something about it, an unspoken fear, a sense of something far worse lurking within those walls. But the hunger was growing, and Seth could feel it stirring inside him, demanding more, feeding off his fear, feeding off his hesitation. He gripped the door handle. The instant he turned it, a rush of cold air swept through him, as if something had exhaled from within the room. It was a sickly, rancid breath, the stench of decay and rot, of something ancient and long forgotten. He stepped inside. The room was vast, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange objects. Old books, jars of something dark and viscous, and pictures that seemed to flicker when he wasn't looking directly at them. Each item in the room seemed to have a history, a purpose. But there was something else here, something far more unsettling. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single flickering light, stood a table. The table was old, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust, but the smell of iron clung to it, the unmistakable scent of blood. Seth's breath caught in his throat as his eyes followed the trail of bloodstains across the floor, leading to the table. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached, each step heavier than the last, his body moving against his will. Then he saw it, a book lying open on the table. Its pages were yellowed with age, the words written in a language that seemed to twist and writhe before his eyes. He couldn't read it, but it didn't matter. He didn't need to understand the words. He understood what the book was. It was a contract, a promise, a binding pact that had been made long before Seth had ever set foot in this cursed house. He could feel it in the air, the weight of the unspoken agreement that lingered, like a noose around his neck. It wasn't just the hunger that held him here. It was something older, something far darker, a presence that had existed long before Seth had ever come to the house. As he stared at the book, the hunger inside him grew. It was a fire now, a blaze that consumed him from the inside out, tearing at his flesh, at his soul. The book was calling to him. He could feel the tendrils of its magic wrapping around him, pulling him closer, dragging him deeper into the abyss. With shaking hands, Seth reached out and touched the pages. The instant his fingers made contact with the paper, a shock ran through him, as though electricity had surged through his veins. The words on the page began to shift, changing before his eyes, the letters twisting into shapes he couldn't comprehend. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room deepening. And then, a voice, ancient and cold, filled his mind. "You have come, you have fed, and now the house claims you." Seth's heart stopped. The voice was not his own. It was the house's, the hunger's. The thing that had been waiting for him, watching him, from the moment he stepped inside. "You cannot leave, Seth. Not now. Not ever." And with those words, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls stretched outward, the shelves warping and bending as if alive, reaching toward him, pulling him into the center of the darkness. The book was no longer in his hands, but it didn't matter. The house had claimed him. Seth could feel the darkness consuming him. It was inside his veins now, inside his very soul. He had fed, and the hunger had taken everything from him. And as the shadows closed in, Seth realized, with a chilling certainty, that he would never escape. Chapter 8. The Weight of Silence. The house was never truly silent. It had never been. Seth had learned that much long ago. But now, in the stillness of the basement, the silence was thicker, more suffocating, as if it were pressing down on him, suffocating his every breath. The air felt heavy, laden with the weight of the house's many secrets, secrets he was no longer sure he wanted to uncover. The walls had a pulse, faint but undeniable, like the beat of a heartbeat that was not his own. It was as though the house, its bones made of rotting wood and decaying brick, was breathing, exhaling with the rhythm of its own life. Seth's heart mirrored it, a slow, unsteady thrum that matched the pulse of the house until the two beats became one. But the hunger was louder, that insatiable, gnawing emptiness within him. It had only grown stronger since he had touched the book in the basement. It gnawed at his insides, clawing, scratching, demanding to be fed. But what could he feed it? What could ever fill the void that had taken root in his soul? He stumbled back up the stairs, his feet unsteady, as though the weight of the house itself was pulling him down. The flickering light in the hallway seemed far away now, distant, as if even the light was growing tired of his presence. The door to the attic was ajar, as it always had been. Seth hesitated before it, the cold sweat on his palms sticking to the metal handle. He didn't want to go back in there. He didn't want to be alone again in that suffocating darkness. But the house was calling to him, its voice low and insistent. It wasn't just the hunger anymore. It was something else, something darker. He entered the attic without a sound, the door creaking on its hinges as he pushed it open. The room smelled musty, like old paper and dust. But there was something else there now, something sharp, like the tang of iron. And then he saw it. The figure was standing at the far corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. Its shape was distorted, elongated, unnatural. For a moment, Seth thought it was just a trick of the light. But no, it was real, and it was watching him. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, two pools of inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light around them. Seth's breath caught in his throat. He had seen those eyes before, in the reflection of the cracked mirror, the same empty, predatory gaze. It spoke, but its voice was not a sound. It was a presence, a feeling, a weight in his chest, an unbearable pressure that threatened to crush him. "You are mine now," it whispered, though no sound passed its lips. Seth's heart pounded, his pulse quickening, but he could not move. He could not run. He was trapped, frozen in place by the unrelenting force of its gaze. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in around him. The shadows stretched, wrapping themselves around him like cold fingers, like the hands of something ancient, something forgotten, something hungry. "You cannot escape," the figure murmured, though the words were not words. They were sensations, emotions, a chorus of thoughts that pierced his mind with the force of 1,000 needles. Seth stumbled backward, his legs trembling, his vision blurring as the room seemed to spin around him. He was being pulled into the darkness. The hunger roared inside him, louder now, deafening. It was a growl, a scream, a whisper. So many things, all at once. It wanted him. It needed him. The figure's eyes never left him. They followed his every movement, never blinking, never looking away. It was not a human thing, not a thing that could be reasoned with or fought. It was something far older, far more malevolent, something that had always existed in the deep corners of the world, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Seth's hands trembled as they reached for the door, but before he could touch the handle, the room plunged into darkness, and the hunger consumed him. Chapter 8. The Weight of Silence continued. The darkness that enveloped Seth was absolute. The air itself had thickened, drawing in around him like a tangible presence, suffocating every breath he tried to take. The hunger had grown to a gnawing, relentless ache within him, pulling him down into the very depths of despair. It clawed at his insides, squeezing, tearing, desperate for release. But there was nothing to feed it, nothing except the shadows that danced in the corners of his mind. He gasped, his chest tight as he fumbled for the door, his fingers brushing against the cold wood. The room spun around him, his vision flickering in and out of focus, as the oppressive weight of the house seemed to press down harder, trapping him in a nightmare that he couldn't escape. His heart pounded in his ears, the frantic rhythm a harsh reminder of his growing panic. But the door wouldn't open. It was as though something was holding it shut from the other side. Something powerful. Something that didn't want him to leave. "Let me out!" Seth's voice was barely more than a rasp, a hoarse whisper that carried no weight in the void of the room. The darkness swallowed it whole. He pressed his palm against the door, pushing with all his strength, but it was futile. It felt like the house itself was closing in, its very walls alive, constricting, tightening. The air thickened with an invisible pressure, and Seth could feel it, this ancient force, this malignant presence, breathing down his neck. Something moved behind him. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, but a soft, almost imperceptible shifting of air, a movement in the very fabric of the room. Seth's spine stiffened, his body locked in place, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn around, but he couldn't. He couldn't bear to face it. "Who? What are you?" he breathed, his voice shaking with terror. The answer came not in words, but in an overwhelming presence, something far older than time itself, something beyond human comprehension. It was as if the walls of the house were whispering, their voices a chorus of forgotten truths, ancient and evil, speaking in unison with a language that Seth's mind could barely grasp. "You fed it," the voice murmured, 1,000 echoes reverberating through the room. "You fed it with your fear, your blood, your soul." Seth's hands trembled as he slowly turned, his body moving against his will, drawn by an unseen force. The figure stood in the center of the room, a dark silhouette, its shape no longer human, its limbs twisted and elongated, stretching into unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue, eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the universe, seeing into places where no mortal should ever look. You're not real," Seth gasped, but the words felt hollow. They were empty, useless. He knew the truth. It was real. It had always been real. And it was here, in the room with him, breathing the same air, feeding off his terror. A low, guttural laugh rumbled from the figure's throat, a sound so dark and twisted that it made Seth's blood run cold. It was a sound that came from the depths of some unimaginable void, a place where time and space had no meaning, a place where horrors were born and left to fester for eternity. "You're mine now," the figure crooned, its voice sliding over him like ice, each word a dagger in his chest. "You cannot escape. You've tasted it, Seth. You've fed the hunger, and now it will consume you, body and soul." Seth's knees buckled beneath him, the weight of the figure's words crushing him, dragging him down into the abyss. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls shifting and warping, twisting into grotesque shapes. The house itself seemed to sigh, its very foundation trembling as if it were alive, as if it too were feeding on his fear. The figure's eyes never left him. They watched him, waited for him to break, to surrender. Seth could feel the presence of the house pressing against him, its grip tightening around his chest, cutting off his breath. The darkness seemed to pull him in, suffocating him, drowning him in its depths. And then, in the far corner of his mind, there was a whisper. It was faint at first, a voice barely audible, but as it grew louder, Seth recognized it. It was the same voice he had heard in his dreams, the same voice that had haunted him, called to him, ever since he had first set foot in this cursed house. It was the voice of the house itself. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice sweet and seductive, like a lover's caress. "You can never leave." Seth felt the pull of the hunger again, stronger now than ever before. It clawed at him, tearing at his flesh, demanding to be fed. The house was alive with it, feeding off his terror, feeding off his soul. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own mind, bound to the house that had claimed him. The figure in the corner took a step forward, its form blurring, melting into the shadows. Seth felt its cold fingers on his skin, icy tendrils that burned like fire. He gasped, his body convulsing, as the hunger inside him surged. The house seemed to breathe louder now, its pulse matching his own, its dark heart beating in time with his own frantic rhythm. Seth could feel the walls closing in, the house shifting, folding in on itself, its very foundation trembling with hunger. The figure stepped closer, its hands reaching out to him, its eyes glowing with that sickly yellow light. And then, in that final fleeting moment of clarity, Seth understood. The house had always been hungry, and now, so was he. Chapter 9. The Hunger of Forgotten Things. The night had no beginning and no end, no real shape or form. It stretched on endlessly, like the body of a forgotten god, coiling and winding around Seth in ways that made his very mind twist with confusion. He could feel the hunger, deep, primal, gnawing at his soul. It pulsed beneath his skin, a deep and insatiable yearning that ate away at him from the inside out. The air inside the house felt wrong in a way that made his skin crawl and his heart beat faster. Every breath felt thicker, heavier, as though the very air itself was an old, rotting thing. And the house, it was alive. Not in the way a living creature is alive, but in a far darker, more terrible sense. It had always been alive. Seth had known that from the first moment he stepped into its depths, though he had never understood the full extent of that truth until now. The walls, the floors, the very shadows, they all seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though they were breathing in time with his own frantic heartbeat. The hunger was everywhere now. It was in the cracks of the walls, the creaking of the floorboards, the whispering of the wind as it howled through the broken windows. It was in the very structure of the house, embedded in every crack and crevice like an ancient, malevolent force that had always been here, waiting. Seth could feel it in his bones. The house was starving. And now, so was he. He stumbled through the narrow hallway, his hands pressed against the walls as he tried to steady himself. His mind felt foggy, clouded, as though something was slowly eating away at his thoughts. Each step he took seemed to send a ripple through the house, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that made him feel like the very foundations were trembling beneath him. Something was watching him. He could feel it. Eyes were on him. Eyes that were not human. Eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. But when he turned, there was nothing. Nothing but shadows, stretching and twisting like the limbs of something far too old to be seen by mortal eyes. The floor creaked beneath him, a low groan that echoed through the empty halls. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing, as he listened for any sound, any movement. The air had grown colder, too cold, as though 1,000 ghosts were pressing against him, their icy fingers brushing against his skin. The hunger inside him had not abated. It had only grown stronger, more insistent, clawing at the inside of his chest, demanding release. He thought of the others, those who had come before him. He could feel their presence in the house, in the very walls. They were trapped here too, lost to the hunger, their souls twisted into something unrecognizable. They had been consumed, devoured by the thing that lived in this place. And now, it was his turn. A soft noise came from behind him, a faint rustling sound, as if something was moving in the darkness. Seth's heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow perhaps, but when he blinked, it was gone, swallowed up by the endless night of the house. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. The hunger was too strong, too overwhelming. It had wrapped its tendrils around him, tightening with every passing second. He could feel it now. Feel it in the pit of his stomach. A gnawing emptiness that nothing could fill. He had to feed it. He had to feed the hunger before it consumed him completely. The house was alive, yes, but so was the hunger. It was a part of the house, woven into its very fabric, and it had been here long before Seth had ever set foot in this place. It had been waiting for someone like him. Suddenly, the house seemed to shift, the walls warping as though they were stretching, expanding. The shadows grew longer, deeper, and from the corners of his eyes, Seth saw flickers. Faces. Too many faces. Staring at him with hollow eyes. Their features twisted into expressions of agony. Their mouths moved, though no sound came from them. They were trapped here, just like him. Their souls forever bound to the house, to the hunger that had claimed them. A soft whisper reached his ears. A voice from somewhere deep within the house. It wants you. The words were like a cold breeze, chilling him to the bone, and yet he knew they were true. He could feel it. The hunger was reaching out for him, pulling him closer to the heart of the house, to the place where it had always lived, where it had always waited. Seth's body moved on its own, his feet carrying him down the dark, narrow hallway. The house seemed to guide him, as though it had always known he would come, always known he would be the one to feed it. He stumbled through the shadows, his heart racing in his chest, each breath shallow and ragged. The walls pressed in around him, the darkness closing in, until it felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting with an ancient and terrible hunger. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. The hunger had already taken hold of him, and soon there would be nothing left. And then, before him, the door appeared. It was old, ancient even, the wood warped and cracked, but it stood in his path as if it had been waiting for him. The hunger throbbed in his chest, urging him forward. He reached for the door, his fingers brushing the cold wood, and with a low creak, it slowly swung open. Beyond the door, Seth saw what lay in the heart of the house. It was a room unlike any other, a place that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of something rotten, something decayed, and in the center of the room, in the very heart of the house, sat the thing that had been waiting for him. It was not human. It was something older, something far more terrible. Its form was a shifting mass of darkness, its body twisting and writhing like a nightmare made flesh. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a sickly yellow light, burning with an insatiable hunger. It was the hunger itself, the thing that had always been here, the thing that had driven Seth to the edge of madness. It looked at him, its gaze piercing through him, and Seth felt the weight of its hunger settle on him like a suffocating blanket. "You are mine," the voice echoed in his mind, a whisper that sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once. And in that moment, Seth understood. He was no longer himself. He was part of the hunger now, a part of the house. And the house. It would never let him go. Chapter 9. The Hunger of Forgotten Things. Continued. The room was a graveyard for the living, a prison for the soul. Seth could feel it in the air, the oppressive weight of its darkness, the ancient dust that coated the forgotten corners of this place like the remnants of lost dreams. His heart thundered in his chest, but the pulse of fear was drowned out by something more dangerous, something more primal, the hunger. It gnawed at his thoughts like a parasite, burrowing deeper with every passing second. He wanted to scream, to escape, but his body was no longer his own. His limbs felt foreign, moving with an unnatural grace, as if guided by invisible hands. The hunger was in his veins now, flowing through his bloodstream, a poison that had taken root and could not be expelled. The house had been alive before, but now Seth could feel it more than ever. It wasn't just the structure or the shadows, it was the essence of the place itself. The walls seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting, as if some malevolent entity was hidden beneath the plaster, shifting with an intelligence far older than time itself. The very foundation of the house was saturated with the echoes of forgotten souls, their whispers crawling through the cracks and into his consciousness. But it was the center of the room that drew his attention, as though it were pulling him in like the pull of the ocean's tide. At its heart was the thing that had been waiting, biding its time until Seth finally arrived. The air shimmered around it, as though the very fabric of reality were distorting. The edges of the room seemed to bleed into the shadows, and the oppressive dark shape in the center flickered like a candle flame in a storm. It was a being of pure hunger, more ancient than any creature Seth had ever imagined. It was the devouring force of time itself, a thing made from the screams of countless victims, from the empty spaces left behind by those who had disappeared into oblivion. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were endless black voids that shimmered with faint cold light. No pupils, no irises, just darkness swallowing the room. Yet Seth knew it could see him. It had always been watching him. "You have arrived," the voice in his mind whispered. But it was not a voice that could be placed in any single direction. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a voice that reverberated in his very soul, crawling beneath his skin, twisting in his thoughts. "You are finally here. You are mine!" The words slid over him like a second skin. The weight of their meaning crushed him, pressing him down, suffocating him. Every syllable was a blade driving into his chest. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The hunger was too strong. It held him in place, like an iron vice clamping down on his chest, forcing him to face the thing at the center of the room. It was no longer a shape, no longer a shadow. It began to materialize, slowly, inch by inch, as if it were stretching itself out from the dark corners of the room, from the very air itself. Its form twisted and writhed like something that had been sculpted from pure dread, from the stuff of nightmares. Seth could see faces within the shadows of its body, faces that were as old as time itself. They were not human, not entirely. Their eyes were wide, bulging, staring at him with an intensity that chilled him to his core. Their mouths were open in silent screams, frozen in an eternal moment of terror. But when Seth blinked, the faces were gone, replaced by something else. A flicker, a movement, a flash of bone, of teeth, of hunger. And then the thing spoke again. Its voice not a sound, but a feeling, an ancient knowing that seeped into Seth's consciousness. "Do you understand now, Seth? Do you understand what you are?" The hunger pressed down on him harder. He couldn't breathe. The walls closed in, the room shrinking, the shadows stretching out like fingers that reached for him, grabbed him, pulled him closer to the center of the darkness. Seth's hands moved without his will, his fingers scraping across the floor, seeking, searching for something to hold on to, anything to stop the overwhelming tide of hunger that was about to swallow him whole. But there was nothing. His vision blurred. His body shook violently, as though he were drowning in a sea of ice-cold water, gasping for air, unable to escape. He could feel his own thoughts begin to crumble, his sense of self dissolving like paper in a storm. "No," he whispered, though he had no idea what he was denying. His throat felt dry, raw. He tried to scream, but the sound was nothing more than a weak gasp that slipped into the void, unheard, unnoticed. The thing in the center of the room reared back, its shape expanding, elongating. Seth felt a pull from within his chest, as if the thing were drawing out his very soul, taking his life force, piece by piece, devouring him from the inside out. He had been wrong. This was not just hunger. It was the hunger that had created all things, the hunger that had consumed worlds and forged them anew. It was not just a force, but a way of being, an eternal law of nature. "You will become a part of me," it whispered, And Seth knew it was not just a threat. It was a promise, a final fate that awaited him, a fate he could not escape, no matter how hard he fought. A sound, barely audible, reached his ears. It was soft at first, a rustling, a faint scraping noise like fingers against stone. He turned his head, or tried to. His body refused to obey. He could only watch as the shadows began to stir, rising from the corners of the room. The whispers grew louder now, an overwhelming chorus of voices that rose up from the very walls themselves. Seth tried to scream again, but nothing came out. The hunger was consuming him, pulling at his insides, making him feel as though every part of him was being torn apart. Then he saw them. The figures stepped forward from the shadows. They were not human, not anymore. They were the remnants of those who had come before him, victims of the hunger. Their bodies were twisted, deformed beyond recognition, their faces contorted in eternal expressions of agony. They were all around him now, surrounding him, their eyes wide with terror, yet their mouths were silent. Their hands reached for him, their fingers crooked and claw-like, but they could do nothing to stop the thing at the center of the room, the one that was about to claim him, to consume him completely. Seth's mind was no longer his own. The hunger had taken over every thought, every impulse. The faces of the forgotten ones swirled around him like a storm of memories, a cacophony of lost voices that screamed for release. The hunger was in everything now. He could feel it in the walls, in the air, in the very bones of the house. And then, with a suddenness that made him feel as though the world had cracked open, he understood. He was not just part of the house now. He was the house. The hunger had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others. He was a piece of the endless cycle, a cog in the eternal machine that fed on souls, that fed on time itself. And as the thing in the center of the room reached out for him with its dark, hungry tendrils, Seth could do nothing but let it claim him. It was done. Chapter 10. The end of the endless hunger. Seth's consciousness felt like a faraway whisper, a faint memory drifting away on the wind. His body, his physical self, was no longer his own, no longer anything he could claim. It was as though he had become one with the dark, oppressive house, absorbed into it like an ancient, cursed relic. He was lost in a realm where time had no meaning, where space bent and twisted until it was nothing but an infinite labyrinth of shadows. The room that had once been so familiar, the place where it all began, had dissolved into a sprawling void. The walls were no longer present, replaced by an abyssal blackness that seemed to swallow every trace of light. And yet, amid the darkness, Seth could still feel the hunger, gnawing at the edges of his mind, like an insatiable beast that could never be sated. He had heard the stories. Everyone in town knew the rumors, the whispers that traveled like dark threads through the streets. It was said that the house had a life of its own, that it was not just a structure, but a living entity, an ancient thing that hungered for souls. Those who had entered never returned, lost forever to the darkness. Seth had always dismissed it as superstition, as the products of overactive imaginations. But now, he understood. The stories weren't exaggerations, they were warnings. Now, Seth was one of them, one of the lost. His breath came in ragged gasps as he floated within the darkness, trying to make sense of the cold, lifeless void that surrounded him. There was no ground beneath his feet, no air in his lungs, no sound to comfort him. The hunger was not just something he could feel, it was everything he was. Every thought, every breath, every pulse of energy within him had become the hunger itself. And then, from the void, it came. The presence, the thing that had drawn him here, that had guided him through this horrific journey, emerged. It was not a shape, not a form that could be defined by words or images. It was a feeling, a sense of something vast and powerful, something older than creation itself, the hunger. But it was more than that now. It had become him. "Do you understand now, Seth?" The voice came again, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a roar that shook his very soul. "Do you see what you have become?" His mind swam, struggling to comprehend the enormity of it. He was not merely a victim, not a helpless soul devoured by the darkness. He had become a part of it. The house had not just taken him, It had molded him, shaped him into a creature of eternal hunger, a being woven from shadows and nightmares. "I am you," it whispered, its voice reverberating in the void. "And you are me." Seth tried to scream, but there were no words left. His throat felt dry, as though it had been consumed from the inside. His body no longer obeyed him. His hands, once his own, were now nothing more than extensions of the hunger, reaching out into the abyss to grasp the souls of those who came before him, those who were still trapped within the house. "Now you will know what it is to never be satisfied," the voice intoned, a terrible, unearthly satisfaction in its tone. "Now you will know what it is to hunger for all eternity." The presence shifted. It was no longer just a voice. It was everywhere. It flooded his mind, overwhelming him with thoughts and images, with memories that were not his own. He saw faces, so many faces, flickering in the blackness like ghosts trapped in the walls of the house, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the others, the ones who had come before him, the ones who had been consumed, twisted, lost to the hunger. He saw their eyes, their desperate faces. They were not the faces of strangers. They were familiar. They were the faces of those who had once crossed his path, the ones he had known, the ones he had loved, his family, his friends. They all stared back at him from the dark, their expressions frozen in eternal terror. "You are mine now," the voice echoed again, a command, a decree. "You will stay with me, forever." Seth's heart, or what was left of it, broke. He wanted to cry out, to fight, to tear away from the thing that had claimed him. But his body would not move. His mind could not escape. There was no way out. And then the hunger took over once more, the endless gnawing, the unrelenting pull. It consumed him whole, devouring what little remained of his will, his consciousness, until there was nothing left but the dark, the shadows, and the eternal hunger. Time had no meaning in this place. Seconds stretched into eons, and eons slipped away into the void. The house, the thing that had consumed him, remained, its hunger never satisfied, its thirst for souls unquenched. It would continue to feed, continuing its endless cycle of devouring the living and the dead alike. And Seth? Seth had become one with the house. He had become the hunger itself. His soul, fractured and lost, wandered the dark halls, the echo of his former self fading with each passing moment. He was not alone, never alone. The others, those who had fallen before him, were still there, their voices blending with his, their hunger becoming his. Together, they would wait for the next victim, the next lost soul to wander into the house's reach. And so the cycle would continue. End.